Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Psych YouTube channel. My name is Michael, and I'm here with Miles. How you doing, man?
I'm good. I'm good. What are we going to talk about today?
Yeah, today we're gonna discuss the human brain size. We're gonna compare it with intelligence and evolution, all that good stuff. So
So
yeah,
why
I'm
would
excited.
we want to discuss that?
So the reason why we discuss that now is because, so if you ask, let's say you ask an evolutionary biologist, right?
Right.
They would tell you, they would say that okay, over the last what 6 million years.
Yeah.
uh, the human brain size has increased tremendously, uh, and there must be an evolutionary reason for that happening.
Right.
Uh,
So basically, what you're seeing is 6 million years ago we were much more ape-like than we are now.
mhm,
We evolved to where we are now, and now we have a big brain. Whereas back then, I mean, we didn't have a small brain, but it increased 3 to 4 times. So
right,
and we are intelligent now. So bigger brains, more intelligence. Right? Easy.
exactly. The issue, I guess, with that statement or that conclusion is that psychologists and even I guess neuroscientists too will look at that today in samples, and essentially what they find is that the brain size between us. So first of all, there's a lot of individual variation in terms of brain size. People have different sizes of the brain, and it varies a lot. And what psychologists and neuroscientists find is that when it comes to intelligence, brain size doesn't really matter that much. Uh, so then begs the question: okay, well, if brain size doesn't matter that much with intelligence, why did we evolve to have such big brains? Uh,
Yeah, and I think that's
yeah,
a good point because, of course, you could argue, yes, a change over 6 million years isn't comparable to just looking at a sample now and saying, okay, there's no relationship between brain size and intelligence.
hmm,
But still, like the puzzle doesn't seem to fit very well, right? If
right,
the increase in brain size is that important for our survival, which it had to be, right? Because
of course.
the brain size from our earliest ancestors, let's say Sahelanthropus chadensis, which lived around 6 to 7 million years ago, if that was
Hmm.
our ancestor, we don't know that for certain, but let's take that one, has a brain size of 3 to 400 cubic centimeters. Now, modern humans have between 1200 and 1500, or let's say 1100 and 1400. It depends a little bit, but
Mm,
that's 3 to 4 times larger. And that had to be important because having a big brain is not always as nice as you would think,
mm,
because our brain takes up a huge amount of energy, even up to 25% of our full energy. So let's say you eat 2000 calories a day, 500 calories just go to your brain to keep it running.
hmm.
And that, in a world where food is always scarce, I mean, for us now it isn't, but
Right.
even just a few hundred years ago, food was scarce. You had to see where you get your food from. Having an organ that takes up so much energy is really not the greatest thing for survival if it doesn't have a huge benefit.
Right.
And so it had to have a huge benefit. And then if we look what makes us so different from other apes, then that would probably be our cognition, our executive functioning. So there you would expect a link there. But then if you
Mm.
look in a sample now, that link is almost not there. So even though we're looking at different time scales here, the puzzle doesn't seem to fit.
Right. It is kind of mind-boggling actually. And I guess maybe we should say it right now. Like I don't think either of us has the answer, right? To why
No,
exactly
absolutely not.
it is the case. But I guess we just want to discuss it, right? But
Right.
yeah, I don't think there is a single concrete answer to this question yet.
No, absolutely not. Which is also partially related to the fact that we cannot go back in evolutionary history to see what actually happened, and what actually did correlate with those increases in brain size. But
Hmm.
maybe let's start with this relationship between brain size and intelligence in us now. Basically, let's if we would take a study of that, what would we find? So when you look at a modern sample and make a correlation between brain size and intelligence, that has been done. And with intelligence, we mean typically IQ. And that is arguable if that is actually a good measure for intelligence, but we might come back to that a little bit later. And brain size, well, you can either look at an MRI scan and calculate the actual size, or you can just look at head circumference. Wow. Circumference, yes, exactly. Which is already a worse measure than actually looking at the brain directly. But anyway, so quite a number of studies have been done about that in the last 100 years, and the results are mixed. Some find a correlation, some do not. But those who do find a correlation, that correlation is small. Typically around 0.2, 0.3. And just to explain what that means in numbers, that means that the fact that somebody has a bigger brain than another person for 4 to 6, 7, 8% is explained by a difference in intelligence. And of course, that's a very small number. And those are the good studies. There are studies that do not find a relationship at all. So when do you find these relationships? Typically when they control for various things. Gender, height, and age. Those are obviously important because gender is already like a huge determinant for brain size, right? Females typically are smaller and therefore also have smaller brains. Yet there is no difference in intelligence whatsoever. Like that is clearly shown. The same is true for height. Taller people are not smarter than shorter people. And although sometimes cognitive functions can decline with age, it's not true that a 60-year-old is less intelligent than a 30-year-old.
And just that is quite telling, right? The fact that we can compare people with smaller and bigger brains, and there's no difference in intelligence there. So that's quite telling.
Right. So if you want to find this correlation between brain size and intelligence, what you have to do is you control for that. You basically take out those factors. For example, there's one study. Well, let me repeat it. There are multiple studies, but I just read one that looked at the relationship between brain size and intelligence in twins and other siblings who were raised together. So you have, let's say you have twins. They are raised at the same parents. They had the same environment and everything. If there is a difference in brain size, and there's always small variations, right? So twin A has a little bit of a bigger brain than twin B. Then that does correlate with intelligence. Again, not too much. Again, those 2 to 4, 5, 6% that are explained, but there seems to be a consistent correlation. Now, when you think about that, what will be the difference in brain size between two twins? That typically is 1, 2%. And you control for everything else. And there might be a difference of IQ from 1 to 2 points. That is not a lot. And then if you go back again to a bigger sample of all people around you, where the difference between one brain and the other can be like, one brain can be almost twice as big as another brain. Those differences can be found. Then those studies, are they that meaningful is the question.
Yeah, like how much inference can you draw from that, right? Like how much can you generalize based on those studies?
Exactly. And then if you, for example, you mentioned evolutionary biology, in that field where you then over 6 million years see that brain size and should be really important. If you go to the field of neuroscience, I'm a neuroscientist, and I've never seen a study, I've never talked to a colleague or never that considered brain size to be important at all. Because when you do a study, what sometimes happens is, for example, you measure working memory, or you measure how good somebody recognizes shapes or whatever. just take a study, and then you look at the brain activity. Sometimes what they might expect a difference between gender or between age or whatever. Then you can take those factors and control for them. You just take them into your statistical analysis and then see if they have an influence or not. Most of the time they won't have an influence, but it's good to take them in there if you have a suspicion that they might. Those will not be your main question, but it's just good to take them with you. I've never, ever seen somebody take brain size as a covariate. So a covariate is a variable you take into account. Never ever seen that with brain size. So basically what that tells you is neuroscience doesn't care whatsoever about brain size. Not at all, not a single bit. Even if there would be a correlation between brain size and intelligence found by some psychologists when you control for A, B, C, D, and F, and E, not don't forget E. Then that doesn't tell you anything about brain function. And that just shows that, again, that puzzle doesn't seem to fit at all.
And like, I just want to say quickly that, I think, so for a person that is not in science, for example, for a person who is not in science, they might assume that, okay, well, we have a big brain. That must be because we are so smart, our intelligence. So when they listen to you then say, as a neuroscientist, that brain size doesn't matter really, then I mean that's a mind-boggling revelation, I think.
Yeah, and it goes totally against that idea that a big brain is somehow beneficial for our intelligence. So
big
yeah,
brain means big intelligence, like.
Yeah, but then coming back to the fact of evolution is it did evolve, and it did evolve to be big, and that had to have some benefits. So whether it is intelligence or something else, our brain evolved to be big.
Right. So it happened. The question is why it happened, and yeah.
Right. So we can, for example, take a look at some of the theories from the evolutionary biology part to see what they tell us about why they think the brain evolved to be big, and then try to fit that in that neuroscience jacket again to see, does that hold up?
Right. Yeah, and I guess one theory that I read about is the social intelligence theory or hypothesis,
right.
Which basically suggests that the reason why we developed a big brain is because we had to develop things like language and kind of social cognition, because that created, or it strengthens our social bonds with each other, and in that sense that strengthens our evolutionary strength, right, or survival rates.
Right.
So that is definitely one hypothesis.
Right.
How would you address that, Miles? Or how would you talk about it?
Yeah, so what you do see is that if you look at brain size and correlate this with group size in social species, there seems to be a correlation. So species with, particularly in mammals, with larger and more complex groups. So I'm not talking about particularly necessarily antelopes with or other herbivores who are in huge groups, but do not have really that kind of social structure. But there you go. That's already like showing that correlation already falls apart with the first example that I mentioned. But yeah, if you would specify it in a certain way, you could say there might be a correlation between brain size and social complexity. Primates who typically have larger brains than other mammals have more complex social structures. But then even within primates, it doesn't hold up again, because if you look at macaques and baboons, they have quite large groups which can go up 50, 100, 200 individuals with quite complex hierarchies within their groups.
Yeah.
And they have smaller brains than, for example, chimps. Now, chimps, they have also complex groups, but their group size is smaller, right? So that particular correlation there doesn't already hold up. so then you would have to say, okay, then we have to look at the complexity of a group, but how do you define that? So
Right.
that's hard. So I would say that social interaction seems to have to do something with it, but it's really hard to pinpoint that down to size. Another study, and that is vaguely related to something you mentioned as well, is language. Is interesting as well. So if you look at genes, right? And I'm not a geneticist. I don't know anything about genes, but one gene that is very important for language and which has evolved quite a bit during our human evolution is FOXP2. It's you can find it in all mammals. It is important for vocalizations, but it is also therefore particularly important for language, and it has evolved quite a bit in the last 6 million years or so. Now, what they have done is they have taken the human FOXP2 gene and implanted that in a mouse. And, it's not like the mouse started speaking, but what they wanted to see is what does change to the structure of the brain when you do that. And the structure did change. But one important thing is the brain didn't get bigger. Brain size stayed the same. So even if you give a mouse the gene for human language, that doesn't mean that the brain becomes bigger. And of course, it's hard to make a conclusion there because the mouse didn't speak, they didn't have the social interactions, they didn't have the groups, you come together with it. But it just shows that just gaining a skill or just learning something new for your survival doesn't make your brain necessarily bigger. For example, a hawk has very keen eyesight, much better eyesight than we do. That makes them very good at hunting animals from afar, and their movement preparation as well has to be a lot better with that as well, right? And that is like a skill that is very important for their survival. But that particular skill didn't make their brain bigger, right? And so we have now a skill which we vaguely term intelligence. So why would that particular skill make it big, right? Why do not all the other skills, like the skill of a sloth to sleep 20 hours a day, why doesn't that skill make it have a big brain?
A fly can fly a lot, right? So their brain must be big as well, right? Like, it makes sense. So essentially, with this social intelligence hypothesis, essentially what you're saying is, while there might be some evidence pointing to it, being correct, there's a lot of stuff that makes it questionable, to say the least.
Yeah, I think one thing we should say here is that there is a correlation, but correlation doesn't mean causation, right?
Right, exactly. Right. And that's also an important thing to know.
Yeah, and that is what you will find in a lot of studies on this topic, because we cannot go back into time. We cannot make a causal, we cannot set up an experiment where we replicate evolution of humans. We just can't. So we have to rely on observations which are correlatory in nature.
Right. Yeah, we basically have to kind of do experiments and then kind of try to explain that this finding that we see now must be the case because of evolution or something which has happened in the past.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So another theory, or it's not really theory, but something important to mention as well is we have to take into account, so a lot of studies take into account relative brain size, so relative to the height or the size, basically, or the weight of an animal. For example, elephants have larger brains than we do. But although for a mammal they are quite intelligent and they have very good memories, to say that they are more intelligent than us would be a stretch, I guess. So then, okay, then you say, okay, but it's relative brain size. So relative, like if you shrink down an elephant to our size, then it has a smaller brain. Now, then so you could argue, okay, intelligence is related to relative brain size rather than overall brain size. Well, that falls apart when you look at ants. Ants have larger brains related to the brain to their actual size than we do.
Right. So then ants should be really, really, really smart then, right?
Right. And then you could argue, well, yes, it is relative brain size, but only from a certain size onwards.
Right.
But
then where's that limit then? Like, what is the brain size where it starts to matter?
Exactly. And when we're talking about these kind of things, what you see is that there's always a post hoc rationalization. We already know the answer. Brains are in us are big and they're smart, and now we try to kind of like post hoc try to figure out how it works, and that's how evolutionary science works. But it is important to question that.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, a lot of that could be risky sometimes because you basically sometimes it's easy to start working backwards from your conclusion, and when you do that, it becomes easy to things that go along with what I'm saying, that's true, and things that go against what I'm saying, nah, I'm just gonna try to explain it somehow or just ignore it or whatever, and that's a problem. So of course we need to be careful with that.
Absolutely. So another one, maybe it's not related to the actual size, but to the amount of neurons. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean that's another topic that people argue that maybe it's not about brain size, maybe it's about the number of neurons that we have in the brain. So how concentrated our brain is.
Right.
Yeah. And what do you think about that, Mas?
It's difficult because still an elephant has more neurons than we do as well. And something that is also quite striking is that a baby, just newborn baby from the first day onwards, has almost the same amount of neurons than an adult does.
They do. Yeah.
Yes, they do. It's interesting. They still develop a lot of connections between the neurons in the first 2 years, and later on as well, but particularly in the first 2 years. But the amount of neurons doesn't change that much. There seems to be some small difference, but nothing major. Maybe 3-4%, whatever. So, I mean, to say that a baby is as intelligent as an adult is also a stretch.
That would be a stretch, right?
And another thing that goes against that is that when you look at brain structures, some brain structures have more dense neurons than others, right? And then, for example, if you look at the cerebellum, which is sometimes called the small brain, which is at the back of the head of a human, or of any mammal, to be specific, it's always at the back of the head, compared to the neocortex, which is the part of the brain that developed particularly in mammals a lot, and for the most in humans, right? We would there are some studies that try to find intelligent traits in the cerebellum, but the cerebellum, the small brain, is mostly used for movement related things, maybe some things related to emotion, and although there might be some indirect links with intelligence or cognitive function or executive functioning, it doesn't seem to be the main part of the brain that is involved in that. Now, the cerebellum has half the neurons of the entire brain, and it has 3.6 times the amount of neurons that the neocortex does. So if the amount of neurons would say something about intelligence, then shouldn't intelligence be in the cerebellum? And moreover, shouldn't have that been the part of the brain that evolved the most? Which it didn't. It is the neocortex that evolved most.
Right. And also the cerebellum exists in basically every other or most other species as well, right?
Right. The cerebellum is a much older structure that can be found particularly.
So then other species should also be intelligent then, right? If that is the case.
Yeah, it can be found in all mammals. I think it can be found in all birds as well. Some reptiles, and it goes back quite far.
Right. So, but yeah, so what you're saying makes sense then that it doesn't make that much sense to claim that, or yeah, it may not be entirely accurate then that the amount of neurons is the thing that explains intelligence.
Right.
Uh,
And the thing is, like, what I should point out, and we pointed out this in the beginning, but I want to point it out again. I'm not trying to bash any of the researchers that have come up with this. I have no answer at all.
Right.
I'm just looking at it from my perspective as a neuroscientist and just seeing that the puzzle doesn't fit. And I don't know even how the puzzle looks like. I don't,
Right.
I'm as bad as making puzzles as any other person is. But I just want to question this, and that's why we have this discussion format, right? We want to ask stuff, and because that eventually leads to more research and hopefully better answers.
Yeah, and again, this isn't a simple, straightforward topic, right? Otherwise, this wouldn't be discussion. This would be a 5-minute, neuroscience 101 video, right? If it was simple and straightforward. So yeah, so we don't know the answers, and we just have a conversation,
Right.
Oh.
So another theory that I want to mention that is not necessarily related to intelligence, but it does definitely relate to evolution of brain size, is the expansive tissue hypothesis. Do you know that one?
It's definitely familiar. Why don't you explain it, yeah.
Yeah. So the idea is that during the course of human evolution, our gut size has decreased, and that is the case. Like we know that, for example, relative to the actual height, the gut size of a chimpanzee is larger, and of a gorilla is even larger than that. Why? Because they are mostly herbivores, and to digest plants, particularly in the case of gorillas who eat leaves as well, which are very hard to digest. It's you need a larger gut to be able to digest it. Now, over the course of human evolution, we started to become omnivores. We started to eat other things than just fruits. And later on, and that is a very important one, we started to cook our food. And cooking food is basically just pre-digesting it, right? You're already making it easier to digest, so to speak. So our gut size became smaller, and the idea behind the expansive tissue hypothesis is that you have a limited expenditure of energy. So when the gut size becomes smaller, that opens up the door for something else to become larger. And in our case, that might have been the brain, because we also developed other skills in that time. And although we already said that skills may not necessarily be related to brain size, if you have this or this expenditure of energy, you can make the brain bigger. And if you can, why not do it, right? Even if it doesn't necessarily relate to skill, it might help or something like that. It's weird to talk about that like that, because you're almost giving natural selection some kind of consciousness.
Kind of like if I have some extra savings this month, I can spend that money on buying something new that I want that I don't need, right, or something.
Exactly. Yeah, it almost seems to be the case. So what we do see is particularly the change from Homo habilis from 2 million years ago, which had a brain size that wasn't that much larger of the first of our first human ancestors to now has been great. And the invention of fire and cooking food, we're not sure when that happened, but it is realistic that it happened around somewhere Homo erectus, Homo habilis, so very early on there. And then from that point, we started to cook our food, which made it easier to digest. Gut size became smaller, and therefore the brain had the opportunity to become bigger. And because it had the opportunity, it took that opportunity. And why that particularly the case, and why not something else became larger, like I don't know, the heart or our entire body or our genitals, nobody knows.
Right. And so I guess to me then this hypothesis, it does, it could perhaps explain that our brains got larger, but not why. Or yeah, I mean, yeah, if that makes sense, right? Like we might say, okay, our brains got larger because of this overabundance of energy. Okay, but why?
Right.
And the theory doesn't really explain that, I think.
Yeah, because the alternative hypothesis is if you just have an uh, expenditure or you have too much energy, then well, you could also just say eat less, which means that
Right.
you can spend more time in the trees, you
Mm,
can be away from predators for more time of the day, you can sleep less, which gives you more attention to look out for predators,
mm,
which then probably would mean that the entire organism would become smaller because it eats less and therefore becomes smaller. But that could be a perfect alternative hypothesis. It doesn't just mean that because um, you are more efficient with your food that you
mm.
necessarily have to grow something.
Right, right. It could also be okay, just eat less, right? Like, uh,
Right. Which
yeah.
means you have to find less resources and so on.
And
So
those will also reasonably be evolutionary advantageous, right?
exactly. So that's the reason why it might explain why the brain had an opportunity to grow, but it doesn't explain why it took that opportunity.
Exactly. That's well put, I think. Uh,
Right.
yeah.
But it is interesting to see that with that increase in brain size due to time we started cooking, that is also
Mm,
the time when we started to use tools. That's the time where we start to have when we start to hunt. We already were walking on 2 feet. Later on, we invented more complex tools and art and rituals and all that kind of thing, language.
mm,
So yeah, it is interesting.
yeah. So, but I think it's quite interesting how we've mentioned now several different theories and hypotheses, and again, none of them seems to have the answer.
Right.
And yeah, so it's quite difficult, I think.
Another thing that we want to mention maybe is that again raises some questions. Is that arguably you could say, okay, Homo sapiens is around for what, 200,000, 300,000 years,
Mm,
um, and you could argue that in the first 190,000 of those, Homo sapiens wasn't doing that much. It was
mm,
hunting, and it was surviving, and
right.
it wasn't making any huge communities. It wasn't, inventing stuff, maybe new tool here or there, but
Mm,
nothing too major. But then from 10,000 years onwards, you see the growth of agriculture.
mm,
People started to figure out how to stay in one place and make crops to survive in one place, which then grew communities. You started to
mm,
see the first villages and cities. People started to specialize because their specialization, they started to learn new skills and really develop those skills. And that's
mm,
when you really get this boom of new things that you invent, and therefore you could argue like more intelligence. Now,
yeah.
that happened 10,000 years ago. Guess what happened in the same time?
What happened?
Our brain shrank. Yeah.
Wow. Well,
So,
if
yeah.
yeah, if that's not telling, then I don't know what is.
Yeah. There is some evidence indeed that the brains of earlier Homo sapiens in Europe from 30 to 40,000 years had larger brains than we find 5 to 6,000 years ago. And it makes sense too,
Mm,
because probably they were taller as well. Like the
mhm,
ones from 30,000 years ago, they were tall because those were hunters. They had to hunt. They had to
mm,
be big and strong, and they had
right.
to fight against mammoth and other animals.
Mm,
Whereas with the start of agriculture, you didn't need that physical appearance anymore. You
right.
were allowed to become smaller. And also, we should mention that the beginnings of agriculture, we now say that was a very smart point, but the first beginnings weren't that good. So there was a lot of famine,
Mm,
which meant that people with less energy survived, which typically are the smaller ones. So that's
mm,
why you see average height going down quite a bit, and with that, um, brain size, which again comes back to the fact that smaller people are not less intelligent than taller people.
Right.
It just happened to be the case that there were more small people around than because, you know, there wasn't as much food.
Mm.
And then of course, because you get smaller, you get less good at hunting, and then you have to stay in your agricultural living style, you know. So one thing that I definitely want to argue, which I haven't read in a lot of papers, what I think may be important to mention is that when we try to see how big a brain was from an earlier ancestor, we cannot look at their brain. Their brain is gone. It's a soft tissue. It doesn't fossilize, typically. So what we have to do is we have to take the skull and then basically just fill that up with fluid and then see how much fluid goes in there, and then we know the size. Now, what we cannot account for is the fact that, of course, not everything in our skull is brain. There is some fluid, the cerebrospinal fluid, and also you don't know how dense the neurons were, right? You don't know how close they were together. Maybe they had a few million less neurons, but we just don't know. Now, one thing that this cerebrospinal fluid is important for is protection against impact. So basically your brain is in a fluid, and if you move around, then it makes sure that your brain kind of moves within that fluid so that you don't get a concussion every time you
turn your head, you know. Like
For hunters and gatherers, particularly hunters, it would have been very important to have that protection of the cerebrospinal fluid. So who knows? Maybe the levels of cerebrospinal fluid and neuron density was larger in earlier ancestors, and that's why they had a bigger skull, and therefore we think they had a bigger brain, and maybe that difference wasn't as big as we think.
Yeah, I mean, that's the question I was going to ask you as well, but I guess you already answered it. I mean, how do we know that the entire skull was a brain and not that they just had a larger amount of cerebrospinal fluid? And there's no way for us to know that, right?
Right. Now, to be fair, if you look at other species, the cerebrospinal fluid isn't like because it's fluid, it doesn't take up that much space. But you could still argue that the protective layer around the neurons could have been bigger, right? The fatty tissue around the neurons could have been just a tiny amount bigger, just to give this neuroprotective that neuroprotective property. For example, if you have a concussion, you see a swelling in the brain. Why does it swell? Because fluid is pumped in there, just to protect against another impact. Right. So having like more tissue around some things, if you had an impact, it could be scar tissue, but generally more tissue around something protects it. So and a good example of that may be the Neanderthal. The Neanderthal had larger brains than we do, and particularly in relation to their body size, because their body size, they were smaller than we were. So if they had bigger brains, which they most likely had, if it relates to intelligence, they were more intelligent, but they probably were not. So again, that's a little bit difficult. So maybe their neuron density was smaller. Maybe they had just big brains where the neurons were more spread apart, where there's more tissue between the neurons just to protect them for impact. Because what we do know from Neanderthals is that they were quite aggressive hunters. They hunted mammoth, and they hunted in a quite aggressive way because they didn't have spears to throw. They had spears to stab, which meant that they had to get close to the animal, and they would have gotten injured. And if you look at the bones we find from Neanderthals, they're all fractured. They have all fractures, like broken arms, broken limbs, broken collarbones, you name it. They have had everything. So they have had impact. So maybe their brain just, wasn't cognitively better. They just had a very big brain to protect all the neurons within it.
And also, so within the skull, right? There's not only is there the brain and the fluid, there's also fibers, right?
Right.
And then maybe they had more of those as well to also further protect the brain, right? Potentially, like I don't know.
Right. Yeah, and that opens another discussion. Like, we're talking about now brain size, number of neurons, but we didn't talk about number of connections, right? The axons, the white matter. And of course, the white matter is also protected by a fatty layer called the myelin sheet. That myelin sheet is important for signal transmission, makes the signal transmission faster, but it's also protective. It also protects the axons. One reason why a baby's brain is so much smaller than an adult's brain has to do with the amount of connections. Because, as I said, a baby's brain has almost the same amount of neurons as an adult does, but has way less connections. And that increases a lot in the first 2 years. And it's funny that a 2-year-old has more connections in the brain, has more wires in the brain than an adult does. And that slowly goes down again. What you also see is that a 2-year-old brain is almost the same size as an adult. It's at 85% or even at 90%. That's why children have such big heads compared to their because their brain is so big. And that growth happens in the first 2 years, even in the first year that they're born. A huge expansion of the brain, together with a huge expansion of neural wiring. So then maybe, hear me out. The amount of neural wiring is important for intelligence.
Yeah, and maybe that's the answer we're looking for, right? Potentially. But have you read much research on that, or do you know research that talks about that?
And that's the point where there is still a lot of ongoing research. It's really hard to talk about it because, again, the cerebellum, it has more neurons, but it has also way more connections. If you look at the Purkinje cell, that's a specific neuron in the cerebellum. If you look at that, it has branches that look like a forest. Whereas, for example, axons in the motor cortex of the neocortex, they look a lot less complex.
And axons, they're the ones where new neurons can connect to, right? To create new pathways.
Right. Now, maybe this, and this is a study I read, is that they suggest that the long-range connections are important. So not only having connections between your neighboring neurons, but also between those neurons and the neuron at the complete opposite side of the brain. Because if those brain functions are different, you could combine more functions with each other.
Right?
For example, you could, if you have a function that is important for survival because you can count something, right? If you can connect that to something that doesn't seem necessarily related but could help you anyway, for example, movement. I'm just spitballing here, but then that might give you in some cases an advantage because you can then count the number of steps you set, which helps you to find a certain resource again that you wouldn't have been able to find if you didn't combine those two functions that seem to have nothing to do with each other.
Exactly.
And those long range connections, they could be really important.
But I mean, those kind of language, those exist also in other animals, right? I mean, even a hawk will combine their sense of sight with, I don't know, memory that, okay, I know I've been here before, maybe, or I don't know how smart they are, but yeah, I mean, my point is, or let's say, what are those animals called? The ones that eat the nuts, that hang in trees and squirrels, yes. I don't know why I forgot that word, but squirrels. I mean, they need to remember where they hid their nuts, right? That they hide, and of course, they need to be able to combine their vision with their memory. So, but squirrels are probably not as intelligent as humans are, right? So, so the question then is also, well, so then maybe it's the amount of long distance connections, right? Maybe we just have more of them.
Yeah, or the diversification or something like that.
Right.
So There was one paper I read in preparation of this discussion, and I think they were basically in their paper doing a discussion as we do now. They didn't have any particular good answers to the question why we have a big brain, but they did raise some questions and some important things. And one thing that I find very interesting is the difference between automatic behavior and basically non-automatic behavior. So behavior that you do that goes against what you would typically do. And it's interesting because in that paper, they really, discussed, okay, we say intelligence, but what do we mean with intelligence, right? Is it just calculating or doing some arithmetics or whatever? No, then they went more into the literature, and then they say, okay, maybe cognitive flexibility. It's the fact that you can change your behavior based on something you observe that goes against what you would typically do. That kind of flexibility may be important. And then they discussed, for example, that other species also have cognitive flexibility, but that it is really hard to test this. For example, they described that crows can learn to use tools. And there is a specific kind of crow in Southeastern Asia that does use tools. So they use sticks to get to insects, and also they can crack nuts by taking them flying up and then letting them fall on the floor. Now, other crow species typically don't do that behavior, but they can learn that behavior. Now, that is then used by some research studies to show, okay, crows have the flexibility to learn tool use. Now, what this article that I read argued is that, well, but is it cognitive flexibility? Because if you would have a crow in the wild that didn't learn it in captivity, and it would have to survive and it would not be finding food, would it then out of itself come up to the idea to use a tool? Probably not. Even though it can learn it when shown, it doesn't mean that it would in a natural setting.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, I guess part of being cognitively flexible is that you can yourself come up with solutions to a problem, right, that you're facing. And if you're only able to do so if someone shows it to you, then maybe you aren't as cognitively flexible.
Right.
Yeah.
There are some examples of apes where they were in captivity for a while because they were abandoned as a baby, and then they are put back into the wild, and sometimes that works out. But then they have learned something in captivity, which they then do in the wild, and then the other monkeys take it, or apes take it over quite quickly, and then you that a certain group of apes takes up a new skill that they didn't have before, and then you see that this progresses into the next generation.
Yeah.
Now, one thing you could say is that monkey that was in captivity, or that ape that was in captivity in the wild, significantly changed the way they live, right? So there was an adaptation going on, something that improved survival. But that one monkey in captivity didn't have a bigger brain than the other ones.
Right.
So those adaptations that we think about most of the time, and also that relate a little bit to this cognitive flexibility, those can happen at chance, right? So let's not take one in captivity, but let's take one in the wild. One in the wild that happens to come across a beehive that has fallen down, and it finds honey for the first time. It eats the honey, finds it very resourceful, shows it to the other monkeys, and now for the rest of eternity, they eat honey.
Right.
That finding of honey didn't change their brain size.
Right.
And that is true for all those new findings, basically. So if that is the case, that couldn't explain why the brain becomes bigger. Now, coming back to this discussion about cognitive flexibility, so then you would say something learned at some point new, as with the example of the crows, for example, is not necessarily cognitive flexibility. So what is it then?
And I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really don't know.
So it's kind of probably it's hard. It's really hard to define as anything related to intelligence. But it may be the fact that we can come up with a new solution to something that we haven't seen before by just analyzing the situation.
Yeah, and that's what I said that I like a lot that you bring this up, because I think when you're talking about brain science, evolution, intelligence, we need to discuss what intelligence is, right?
Right.
That is an important question as well in this, because I guess the way you define intelligence can definitely impact the conclusions that you draw. So
Right. I mean, we're talking now for 15 minutes. We should have done this earlier, but
right, this should have been one of the first things we addressed. But yeah, I mean, oh well.
Yeah. But yeah, so what could be the case? And I thought about this analogy, and then I still have to think about this for myself as well. But for example, you have an automatic behavior, right? And a certain kind of animal can then learn to, okay, but if that happens, then I cannot use that automatic behavior. For example, you would dig for certain kind of roots to eat, but then if there are no trees, then I don't need to dig because that doesn't make any sense. But that is kind of automatic behavior with one exception, right? Maybe it's the case that we have just an almost infinite amount of exceptions to the rule in our brain, and that we can only have that by having connections between brain regions that you wouldn't expect to find, and this complex wiring, which is to override automatic behavior. So that's why we can come up with solutions to things that we haven't seen before, right? We can come up with a solution to a certain thing that we haven't seen anybody else do. We had to analyze the situation. We found out that the thing we were doing didn't work, and then we tried something else. Right. And that's maybe why trial and error works so well in us as well.
Yeah, because we keep trying new things until it works,
Right. And that is kind of, and then you say, okay, where does that then come from? I think maybe where that could be important is, for example, in making of tools, right? 2 million, maybe 3 million years ago, we started to use tools. But we didn't only start to use tools, we started to make them. Now, when you make a tool, that is a lot harder than you think. It's not just ramming two stones together, right? You have to really be specific.
Right.
And that can be a pattern that can be quite complex, where you have to have like 6 strokes in a particular order, in a particular direction to get one flake off so that it is really sharp. Now, first of all, planning forward those 6 steps rather than just 1 or 2 steps is very important.
Yeah.
And that kind of planning is something which we don't really see, at least not in those many steps in other animals. We do see planning for the future a lot, for example, with the squirrel, but that's one step, right? Now I forgot the word of what they look for.
Nuts.
Nuts. Oh, what a complex word.
Right.
Find nuts, hide them, come back later. But making a tool, those are more steps. And more importantly, if one step goes wrong, you have to rethink your plan. And I think that is where something like this cognitive flexibility in its purest sense, overriding automatic behavior, is really important, and where it could have developed.
Right. But then there must have been already I mean, this cognitive flexibility must have already been there then, right? So then it's not necessarily only that the brain allows us to be cognitively flexible, it is also that cognitive flexibility is what allowed our brains to grow.
Right. And of course, there had to be some rudimentary stuff in our ancestors as well. It's like a gradual change that then somehow exponentially goes up.
Right.
I think another thing that is related to that is working memory.
Mm.
So working memory is kind of the short-term memory, which is probably familiar to most people. But then you do something with that short-term memory. So for example, if you have the number 3, 4, and 5, you can hold them in your short-term memory. But if you have to say, I have to calculate 3 plus 4 plus 5, then you have to use your working memory because you have to remember the 3 numbers, but also add them up. You do something with them.
Right.
Now, when making a tool where you have 6 steps and you have step 2 only works after step 1 and step 5 only works after step 4, that's where you need this working memory. And working memory is a particular thing that is very good in humans compared to other species. There are not a lot of species who have working memory. They have short-term memory, but not necessarily working memory. And again, this you have something and you do something with it. And that's, again, where this flexibility is needed. And I think if we would have to pinpoint down what makes a human now so different from an ape, I mean, we are apes, but now just for, what makes us Homo sapiens different from non-Homo sapien apes, then I would guess that's probably a combination between overriding automatic behavior in a cognitive flexible way combined with working memory, which both are part of what we would call intelligence.
Right.
But if you would say intelligence, it would not just be that, right? If you do an IQ test, there's way more in than just that. So if that makes us unique, then it has to be that made our brains big.
Right.
And whether that is the case, I don't know, because coming back to our original story, I've had participants with a brain size of 950 cc and another participant of 1600 cc. So basically a brain that is 70% larger of the first participant 1 and participant 2. Those were both cognitively flexible. They had the same background. They both studied psychology. So they were probably, they had at least an average IQ.
Right.
So even that entire story doesn't seem to really hold up in explaining why one brain is bigger than the other.
Yeah, even if what drove our brains to be bigger is working memory, and you said cognitive flexibility.
Right.
Yeah, it still doesn't tell, as I said, the story, because then you would assume that the person with almost twice as big a brain should be twice as smart or twice as good at working memory and cognitive flexibility. But that's not the case, right? So then the question is still unanswered,
Right. Now, what we probably can pinpoint a little bit, to some extent, maybe we shouldn't say, okay, it's brain size, but it's maybe some parts of the brain.
Right.
And we already said, it's probably not the cerebellum, although that would have been a good candidate. Our natural selection didn't choose the cerebellum. Well, stupid of natural selection, but whatever.
It is what it is.
It is what it is. So if you look at what developed most in the human brain compared to, for example, an ape, that would be, Michael?
The frontal part of the brain.
Yes, the prefrontal cortex.
The prefrontal cortex, yes.
Now that tends also to be the region where that becomes active when you do a working memory task, when you do planning, when you do all this kind of good stuff that is related to intelligence. So maybe it would be better to say, okay, the connections there and the size of that particular brain region was very important for our evolution. That grew, and that is maybe a better predictor of intelligence. And there are some studies that do show that if you select out the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, we do see that evolved most compared to our to other apes. And we tend to see that working memory benefits may be related to that. But still, it still remains a very variable and very complex topic. And a person with a bigger prefrontal cortex still isn't necessarily more intelligent than somebody with a smaller prefrontal cortex.
Right.
But if we would have to pinpoint it down to some extent, it would be there. I guess. Maybe. Potentially.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Possibly. Right. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting if we come back to the Neanderthal again, which I said had a bigger brain overall. We don't know how their brain looked like. Let that be clear, because we don't have a brain with them. But if you look at their skull size, and if you would have to fit into a brain in there, then probably in relation to everything else, their prefrontal cortex wasn't as big as ours. Yeah. That's why we have a flat forehead and they had like a kind of like shaped off head. We have much more space here in the front of the head. Which then may again explain why those are the ones that died out and we're not, because we may have had a cognitive advantage above that.
Right. And if we then also had a larger prefrontal cortex, then again, then that draws a directly, or it draws a correlation then between the size of prefrontal cortex and cognitive flexibility. Yeah, but again, as you said again, the size of that is not directly, or not necessarily. It doesn't necessarily mean that we are smarter, right?
Right. And one thing that fascinates me is, well, yes. So probably having a bigger prefrontal cortex is evolutionary beneficial, but that doesn't explain the huge amount of variation. I still find that so amazing. One brain of two people living in a somewhat same area, and can have brains that are so much different, 70-80% difference, and yet there is absolutely no difference in their intelligence or whatsoever. And you could say, yeah, but there's variability in everything, right? So some people are taller than others, and some people are they have longer arms, and they have their eyes are further apart or whatever. But I mean, this is just a gut feeling, but I have the feeling that brain size differences somehow are, that the variability there is larger. And particularly if you're going back to this idea that the brain takes up a lot of energy, from an evolutionary perspective, it would make sense if the brain would be as small as it can be and still have the same, the optimal function.
Right.
Because the bigger it is, the more energy it takes. It's heavier, first of all. You have to carry it.
Right.
So smaller it is, the better it is. It's also better for childbirth. Although, of course, a baby's brain may not necessarily relate to the brain size you have later on, but still. Yeah. So to me, it's fascinating that I had this participant with a 950cc brain, which from an evolutionary perspective is a great solution. It's just big enough to do everything that person needed to do. And then you have this other participant with a 1600cc brain. And I'm asking myself, why? Why does his brain need to be that big? Does he need to compensate for something else? I don't know.
Right. Maybe. But I think I think you're raising a good question, because I think so the individual variability in brain size between people is really complicating this issue, I think, because if you only would you compare, our species with other species, you see a difference in our brain size, you see a difference in maybe the proportional size of prefrontal cortex, and then you also see that we have more intelligence, whatever that means, and you draw a correlation between those two things. But it all becomes much more complicated then when you look at, okay, well, if this region or if brain size is related to these functions, why don't we see those findings when we compare humans with each other. So I think the individual variation really makes this more complicated, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, it just shows that individual differences, having a big brain, you sometimes see those memes like big brain mode or something like that.
Right.
And although I, of course, understand that that is just, a joke,
Right.
it just doesn't reflect reality.
Mm.
And with computers getting smaller and smaller. We back in the 70s we had a computer that was the size of a room, and now we have a smartphone that has way more function than that in a much smaller space.
Right.
So having functionality doesn't necessarily imply size. So
Right.
I'm not so sure we should be so proud of our big brain if a small brain can do the same thing as well.
It's like comparing those. Like, did you ever used to have a PS2?
A what? Yeah, of course, yes.
Like, remember, like those memory cards that was like what, 512 megabytes, how big they were, and now we have small micro, chips with like, hundreds of gigabytes, terabyte, like it's crazy.
Right.
So,
And that also just shows that, there have been studies in the past, and there still are, that look at relative size of particular brain regions, and it's difficult. Of course, there's neuroplasticity. So, a brain region that is used more will form stronger connections. But that doesn't necessarily imply that that brain region becomes larger. I think in a previous video, we talked about the brain of Einstein, right? That it wasn't bigger than average, and that surprised scientists. No, well, first of all, it didn't. And second of all, then in that article, they discussed, but his parietal cortex may have been a little bit bigger, and that would have given him the advantage in understanding math. And I'm like, well, maybe not. I mean, apparently size doesn't matter, and even size of individual regions, I don't think is that predictive of actual skill. So, I mean, look at my brain. If you look at an MRI of my brain, my visual cortex is so crooked, it's so skewed. My one part of the visual cortex is kind of hanging over the other one. One part of my visual cortex is a lot larger than the other one. I don't see better in one direction than the other.
Like, is your left visual field better than the right one? Like,
no, it's not. There's absolutely no difference in my visual field. So just because, maybe I fell on my head and that's why it's gotten bigger, because there's no scar tissue or whatever. I don't know, but so no size. It's still interesting to me that we have seen this development and evolution of increase in brain size, and that it had to be so important just to end up being not important at all.
Right. Yeah. So you're saying size doesn't matter? Got you.
Yeah, I'm saying size doesn't matter.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, like, I don't have anything else to add here. I mean, like, we had a really cool discussion, and we haven't answers, what I'm saying? Like, we have nothing. An hour-long discussion and we have no answers at all.
That's how science works, right?
That's science. We just talk and try to find answers. I mean, we often don't find it.
Right, absolutely. Yeah. But it's still, I find it a very interesting topic, and I really hope that we one day can make some steps to understand what really happened in the evolution of our brain.
Right. Yeah, and maybe someday we will. Who knows?
Yep.
Maybe you'll win a Nobel Prize someday. Finding some groundbreaking, findings on why our brains are as big as they are.
Well, I doubt that, but I need a bigger brain to get a Nobel Prize.
Exactly, because bigger brain means bigger intelligence, right?
Exactly. All right, let's cap it off here.
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah, and if you enjoyed our video, give a like. Or also in the comments, write down what you think, your ideas on why we might have a big brain. And yeah, follow us on social media. and subscribe and all that good stuff, and yeah, I guess we'll see you in the next video.
All right. See you the next time. Bye-bye.
Peace.